Hi, everyone. My name is Marcelyn Gow, and I'd like to welcome you all to our final lecture in the spring lecture series here at SCI-Arc. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Zeynep Çelik Alexander, who is an architectural historian, and she is currently an associate professor at the University of Toronto. Zeynep's work focuses on the history of architectural modernism since the Enlightenment. My own introduction to Zeynep's work, which was a huge inspiration for a course that I ended up sort of putting together with a colleague, Tim Iveson here. It was a 2-semester course that kind of grew out of a reading of a text by Zeynep called Neo-Naturalism that appeared in Log 31, New Ancients. In that text, Zeynep discusses the ways in which the discipline of architecture has shifted from a close engagement with the humanities to a more recent position where the natural sciences have emerged as the privileged model. And I think this is something that really got me thinking about the different forms of appropriation that have been instrumental in shaping both our discipline and our discourse, and some of the questions that are currently arising as new technologies begin to reshape the way we think about data, something that Zeynep has talked about, the difference between data versus facts, and what would a history of data as opposed to a history of facts look like. And I think that Zeynep's work provides a critical reflection on architectural pedagogy at a moment when the role of the architect is really becoming actively redefined by shifting political, social, technological, and ecological paradigms. And we just had a really fantastic opportunity to hear Zeynep in conversation with Michael Osmond, our colleague who's also here this evening, where they discussed the history of design and the production of knowledge. And some of these themes I believe that Zeynep will also touch on tonight in her lecture. So just a few more formal facts about Zeynep Çelik Alexander was trained as an architect at Istanbul Technical University and Harvard Graduate School of Design. Zeynep received her PhD from the History, Theory, and Criticism program at MIT. She's the author of Kinesthetic Knowing, Aesthetics, Epistemology, Modern Design, and has published in journals including Harvard Design Magazine, Log, eFlux, Grey Room, Journal of Design History, and Centropa. A second research project co-directed with John May, who may be with us as well tonight, I'm not sure, and funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, explores the histories of technologies that have come to dominate contemporary design disciplines. The project is forthcoming as an edited volume. Zeynep's current research further explores architectures of bureaucracy from the New Herbarium to the Larkin Administration Building. She's a member of Aggregate Architectural History Collaborative and an editor of the journal Grey Room. Please join me in welcoming Zeynep Çelik Alexander to SCI-Arc. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I also want to thank the students of SCI-Arc who I hear invited me, especially Louisa. I am particularly flattered when students invite me. I love that. So I'll talk tonight about the research that I have, for the most part, laid to rest. The research that has appeared in my recent book, Kinesthetic Knowing. And this book is an epistemological history of modern design education. It inquires into the history of the peculiar kind of knowledge produced within design schools, such as the one that we're in. It asks under what historical conditions this knowledge was produced, using what kind of practices, and to what ends. So when I was kindly invited to give this lecture, I thought to myself, what better place to present this material than SCI-Arc, a school known for the vibrancy of its design culture. I will talk mostly about the Bauhaus tonight, that institution which figures as the mythic beginning in most accounts of modernism, especially as the beginning of a new pedagogical model that is assumed to have replaced Beaux-Arts training. But the Bauhaus in my story will be a less radical and more backward-looking enterprise than most of these accounts would like to acknowledge. Hence the title of my talk, for which I should add, I'm indebted to Mark Wigley, who was around just yesterday, Drawing Circles. Drawing a perfect, self-enclosed shape like a circle, if you think back to your very first art class, requires a great deal of coordination, but also a degree of intellectual abandon. Conceptualizing it too much will make your hand go askew, just as thinking about going down the stairs might make you stumble and fall. So as I show you circles being drawn tonight, I'm also hoping that you will start thinking about a more contemporary set of questions. What has changed and what has remained the same in design education since the late 19th and early 20th century history that I will outline tonight? Given this history, how can we reconceptualize the epistemological models that are at work in schools of design, schools like SCI-Arc? Or, to put it differently, have we been drawing the same circle over and over again in design schools? I will not attempt to answer these difficult questions during the talk, but I am hoping that they will hover in the air so that we can return to them in the discussion. So let me start where the book starts, with an experiment in which children were not drawing forms, but they were looking at them. One day in 1905, a German school teacher by the name of Rudolf Schulze gathered a group of 11 and 12-year-old girls in the courtyard of an elementary school in the 6th precinct of the city of Leipzig. Arranging them in 3 rows, Schulze asked the girls to perform the same sequence of actions 12 times with 12 different pictures. First, the girls would close their eyes while a picture was placed before them. Next, they would be asked to open their eyes and look at the picture carefully. Finally, and within a few seconds really, a photographer would document the girls' expressions using a camera placed behind the picture. When Schulze published the results of this peculiar experiment a year later, he asked 4 grown-ups to describe the emotional expressions documented in the photographs and to try to match the photographs with the pictures that had presumably produced the expressions. The results were astounding, he announced. With 2 exceptions out of 48 possibilities, the adults guessed correctly which picture belonged with which photograph. This was exactly the result that Schulze, an ambitious advocate for educational reform, had been hoping for. Given their age, gender, and social class, the subjects of the experiment had no hope of advancing to a higher level in the strictly hierarchical German school system. Yet, Schulze argued, the experiment proved that even these most unpromising of students demonstrated an intelligence, albeit of an unconventional kind. An intelligence that manifested itself not in the girls' facility with spoken or written language, but rather in the minute muscular movements evident in their facial and bodily expressions. After witnessing this extraordinary emotional richness, he pleaded with his reader, who could possibly speak of the cognitive rawness of the insensate masses again? If these subjects were in possession of an unconventional kind of intelligence, shouldn't the education system be changed to address it? In analyzing the girls' facial and bodily expressions, Schulze used a specialized terminology borrowed from the relatively new discipline of experimental psychology. His technique for arranging the expressions along an x-axis of arousal and repose and a y-axis of pleasure and displeasure, for example, had been modeled after the three-dimensional theory of feeling developed by Wilhelm Wundt in his world-famous experimental psychology laboratory in the very same city, in Leipzig. In other experiments, Schulze measured the involuntary muscular contractions, breathing, pulse, sweating, etc., of his subjects in an attempt to arrive at an even more rigorous and quantitative method for analyzing their responses to images. A few years later, when he repeated the experiment, he used film, a technology that was more appropriate, he argued, for capturing the temporal unfolding of movements across the faces, hands, and bodies of his subjects. Experimental psychology itself had been founded upon psychophysics, a field that claimed to be able to correlate every sensation psychologically felt by the subject quantitatively to a physical stimulus. It wanted to be able to say, in other words, that stimulus X causes sensation Y. Informed by psychophysics, it was argued in the 19th century, the discipline of psychology was auspiciously poised between the human and the natural sciences. An instrument such as this aesthesiometer made a quantitative science out of something as elusive as experience by measuring the minimum distance at which those two pricks felt as two pricks as opposed to one. Rehearsing this logic of correspondence, Schulze's experiment assumed that forms, lines, and colors of pictures produced immediate reflex-like emotional effects on their recipients. Formal qualities struck these subjects, as it were, like lightning. The horizontality of a landscape painting forced the eye muscles to move sideways rather than up and down, Schulze wrote. The vertical orientation of the cross in a crucifixion scene turned the eyes upwards, compelling the children to assume a pious pose. It was for this reason that Schulze compared his own analysis to those undertaken in the 1860s by the French physiologist Duchenne, who had attempted to induce emotional expressions artificially by applying electrical currents to the appropriate facial muscles. Schulze simply replaced electrical current with forms in his experiments. The mechanics of Schulze's formalism are unmistakable to any student of modern aesthetics. But the girls in Schulze's experiment did not conform to the ideal demanded by Bildung, that notorious German word signifying both institutional instruction and personal cultivation. That is, these were not male and Protestant model subjects targeted by Prussian educational institutions throughout the 19th century, especially since Humboldtian reforms. In fact, the girls' enjoyment was diametrically opposed to the disinterested pleasure associated with Kantian aesthetics, or, for that matter, to the intellectual contemplation that Schulze's contemporaries would expect of students at the much more prestigious gymnasium. In Schulze's experiment, taste as aesthetic discrimination transformed into taste as the most vulgar of the senses, as in the sweet, sour, and bitter tastes of sugar, lemon, and aloe. Schulze's contemporaries would say, in fact, that this was not aesthetics from above, but rather from below. The experiment forced aesthetics to abandon its lofty position next to philosophy and to come down to an ordinary schoolyard in Leipzig. Now, Schulze's peculiar experiment encapsulates the ambitious and programmatic 19th century epistemological project that is detailed in my book, a project that privileged a kind of knowledge assumed to be realized without language, concepts, or propositions. Others before the 19th century had theorized the possibility of such an alternative epistemological principle. Leibniz, for example, wrote of an unconscious appetition, an intelligence unique to the body without any contribution from the mind. Wolff of sensuous knowledge, Schleiermacher of organic intelligence, and perhaps most tellingly, Baumgarten, the 18th century philosopher credited with having coined the term aesthetics, theorized a sensuous cognition, which he claimed was an analog to reason proper. But none was quite as influential as the distinction made by the formidable German physicist and physiologist Hermann von Helmholtz between two kinds of knowledge, as expressed by two common verbs used to denote knowing in German. This is what he wrote. Besides the knowledge, Wissen, this is the first kind of knowledge, the knowledge realized with prepositions, logic, and language, that operates with concepts and is therefore capable of expression in words, there is another department of our mental operations, which only combines sensual impressions that are not capable of direct verbal expression. In German, we call this Kennen. This is the second kind of knowledge. As when we say that we know a man, a road, a dish, an odorous substance, we mean that we have seen, tasted, or smelt these objects, hold on to their sensual impression and memory, and will recognize it again when it's repeated, even though we may never be able to describe the impression in words, even to ourselves. Wissen, knowledge attained through concepts, propositions, and language, was the goal of rigorous science, physics or chemistry, history or philosophy. Kennen, by contrast, was a non-conceptual, non-prepositional, and non-linguistic knowledge, obtained through experiential acquaintance with the world. But the radical point of Helmholtz's argument was this: if Wissen operated with the logical induction of the conscious mind, Kennen operated with what he called aesthetic induction, an equally rigorous and yet unconscious mode of reasoning. Helmholtz noted, for example, that a violin player who could strike a note with his fingers so precisely that the instrument's vibration would not be out by 100th part was using this kind of Kennen. It was almost as if a miniature logician was embedded in the musculature of the body. This also meant that under the right circumstances, Kennen could potentially produce sciences as rigorous as those historically produced by Wissen. In the last decades of the century, this Helmholtzian distinction between Wissen and Kennen was evoked again and again in Imperial Germany by curators and museum directors who established the first museum education programs, by politicians who made drawing courses mandatory in primary and secondary schools, by professors who claimed that art history had a privileged place in the so-called mass university, and by artists, architects, and critics who advocated for a new mode of artistic training. So much so that by the end of the century, the philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey would suggest that this other way of knowing, what Helmholtz called Kennen, should be the foundation of all human sciences, just as mathematics was the foundation of all natural sciences. For this, he and others argued, it was necessary to turn to psychology, that rigorous science of experience that had only recently turned to experimentation. If the most frequently used word in German for ascribing this alternative epistemological principle was the untranslatable Anschauung, a presumed direct and intuitive intimacy with the world through the senses, the most poetic must have been Dilthey's equally untranslatable silent thinking, schweigendes Denken, that strange German active verb that denotes a passive action, schweigen. But because I have no poetic sensibility whatsoever at all, I've been calling it kinesthetic knowing, a kind of knowledge presumed to be achieved through experiential immediacy rather than through intellectual mediation. I should add that the experience that became the focus of this project was not just any experience, even though it was described repeatedly as lived, embodied, and immediate, and analyzed with methods developed in psychology. It was always structured in relationship to its doppelganger Wissen, propositional knowledge, and imagined to be structured in a very psychophysical kind of way by the body's movements in response to stimuli, even when the movement might be in potentia. Kinesthetic knowing, however, was not only an intellectual project. Pedagogues in late 19th century Germany saw in it the opportunity to develop techniques to instill new habits in these lesser subjects of modernity. It's not a coincidence, in other words, that you are looking at young girls again. More relevant to where we are right now, in institutions such as the Bauhaus, these techniques transformed into what we have come to call modern design education. In the time that I have left, therefore, I will turn to the Bauhaus and try to demonstrate how 3 of the techniques of kinesthetic knowing were codified and transformed into habits in modern design education. First, feeling. And yes, I'm thinking of feeling as a technique here before I get any reaction. In this questionnaire that Wassily Kandinsky circulated in his wall painting workshop at the Bauhaus, he asked his students to fill in the 3 blank elementary forms with the appropriate primary color. And this is a filled questionnaire. Obviously, you have to imagine a blank one. We can only assume that the poor students knew exactly what was expected of them as they dutifully filled in the triangle with the yellow, the square with the red, and the circle with the blue. But the point of such an experiment was, in Kandinsky's words, to understand the bridge between the inner and the outer. In Kandinsky's courses, formal qualities were correlated to affects, just as in Schulze's experiment. Right angles were red, acute angles yellow, and obtuse angles blue. One student added his notes to the questionnaire. The 3 color form combinations corresponded to the musical tempos of presto, andante, and grave, precisely because they triggered the pulse rates of 135, 75, and 50, respectively. I'm not sure if you can see it. They're just right there. And as far as I know, if your pulse drops to 50, you die, but maybe I'm wrong. Others at the Bauhaus might have disagreed with Kandinsky, for example, Oskar Schlemmer did, about whether yellow or blue triggered a faster heart rate, but they did not question that the relationship between forms, colors, lines, and affect was one of immediacy. This pedagogy was not only elementarist, primary forms, primary colors, etc., but also foundationalist. The most radical component of the Bauhaus curriculum, as you know, it has been repeated many times, was its foundational or preliminary course, otherwise known as the Vorkurs, Vorlehre, or Vorunterricht. Taught first by Johannes Itten and later by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and Josef Albers, and complemented with Formlehre, theory of form, classes taught by Paul Klee and Kandinsky, the preliminary course at the Bauhaus trained all students in form, line, and color, regardless of their future specialization in a workshop. Yet, the preliminary course was by no means new when it was instituted at the Bauhaus. Decades before Kandinsky taught his theory of form at the Bauhaus, Formlehre, or theory form, and Raumlehre, theory of space, were instituted at German elementary and secondary schools as propedeutic courses. So a Vorkurs of sorts that was assumed to be necessary before more intellectually challenging activities were undertaken. Ever since Pestalozzi and his student Froebel's object lessons at the turn of the 19th century, teaching children to draw was considered the first step toward the goal of teaching them to write or to compute. Reformers like Schulze now propose to convert this first foundationalist step into general education. A general education for subjects that departed from the 19th century ideal of Bildung. In other words, design was developed as a propedeutic of sorts in the German school system long before the Bauhaus. Elementary forms and colors played 2 but mutually reinforcing roles here. On the one hand, they served as the common denominator for those who did not quite fit the subject type demanded by the loftier ideal of education. On the other hand, it gave these subjects imagined to be alarmingly open to the influence of external impressions, a concrete experiential anchor. By the turn of the 20th century, the same kind of preliminary Vorkurs became the distinguishing mark of a new kind of art school that started to appear all over German-speaking lands. And this is a little-known history, but these schools, of which there were many, especially attracted women students who could not gain admission to academies at the time. The Debschut School in Munich, Endel's Formschule in Berlin, Behrens's Kunstgewerbeschule in Düsseldorf, and others, as you can see in this 1907 advertisement. And they all had preliminary courses before the Bauhaus. As in the tables on your left, in which the architect Endel correlated elementary feelings to architectural forms, and strangely enough to words, it's a longer story, And the diagram on your right, in which the artist Debschitz did the same for lines, theory at these schools was essentially a theory of form. Crucially then, when Klee or Kandinsky's Formlehre came to serve the same propedeutic function at the Bauhaus, it was proposed not only as the foundation of artistic training, but more broadly as education for that elusive subject of modernity. Second, drawing. After walking to and fro several times, Itten approaches the easel. He picks up a piece of charcoal. His body tenses up, as if becoming charged with energy, and then suddenly goes into action. Once, twice. One sees the form of two forceful lines, vertical and parallel, on the top sheet of the pad. The students are asked to repeat this. The master checks their work, corrects their posture. Then, beating time, he orders them to do it rhythmically, and then has them carry out the same exercise standing up. What is intended seems to be a kind of body massage, to train the body machine to function sensitively. Similarly, new elementary forms such as and others are demonstrated and copied, for instance, and with several explanations of the why and wherefore and the mode of expression. In the end, they all become a little tired, and he sets his preliminary course students the same task work as homework. This is the quote that I should have put it up. Sorry. So but the point here is words are actually replaced by little drawings. This is how Klee mocked Itten's version of the preliminary course at the Bauhaus. Itten returned the compliment by describing Klee's lecturing style as old, classical, academic. Klee held too tightly onto the written word in his meticulously formulated notes, Itten claimed. Itten claimed that he, by contrast, never wrote anything, not a single word. Howard Deanstein, fresh out of Columbia College, was struck by the difference between his American education and the training that he received at the Bauhaus. We were not required to draw in minute detail the 5 orders of architecture, he noted. We didn't copy plaster reproductions of classic sculpture or digest the writings of Vitruvius or Palladio. Language, he observed, played only a minor role at the Bauhaus. Itten's preferred pedagogical technique, in fact, was to command breathing and humming exercises, which he argued allowed arms, hands, and fingers to be permeated with feeling. Such exercises as drawing with 2 hands simultaneously was to enable the student to overcome the intellect and to give oneself totally to spontaneous feeling. Paradoxically, the spontaneous manner of drawing, pointedly, unlike the academic practices of copying and imitating, appeared at the Bauhaus alongside a device that seemed to serve the opposite purpose, the grid. Followers of Pestalozzi, remember, had already identified the grid as a pedagogical tool, but the grid arrived at the Bauhaus only after being substantially altered through a late 19th century filter, the Kulturkampf, the primarily Prussian crusade against German Catholicism after the unification of the German states in 1871. If the most controversial part of Kulturkampf, this campaign against Catholicism, were the so-called folk laws of 1872, which placed restraints on Catholic clergy's control of schools, the most surprising, at least from our perspective, was the introduction of drawing instruction into elementary and secondary school curricula. Drawing classes were made mandatory in Prussia in 1872, in Saxony in 1874, and in other states thereafter. How did drawing become an anti-Catholic measure? I've been saying the masses in an imprecise manner so far, but historians tell us that in late 19th century Germany, the masses were cast in the mold of Catholics. In the Protestant imagination, at least, the suggestible, politically naive selves of Catholics were the foil to the unitary model of selfhood promoted by Prussian educational policies. Advocates of Kulturkampf saw in kinesthetic knowing the potential to save these subjects from themselves. As object lessons turned form into a silver bullet of education, the grid acquired new valency in the classroom. Especially popular, again, was a technique called stigmography, developed at mid-century by the Austrian pedagogue Hillard, a technique that presumably simplified matters in the classroom. So stigmography worked as follows. The teacher would draw a red grid on the blackboard, and the students would redraw the grid as a white grid on their individual slates, and somehow this, with the assumption that somehow like copying it onto a grid made instruction easier to follow. The grid did not only teach students how to draw, but turned drawing into the very first step of every academic activity. This is crucial. With the aid of stigmography, writing, drawing, and even music became first and foremost form. This grid and cutout elementary shapes found in the Kandinsky archives, presumably used during class, so far as I could determine, look different in light of this history. We're accustomed to assuming that abstraction is a crucial element of the history of modernism. But abstraction here is not an end in itself, but rather a means to undertake a pedagogy that would cultivate a very particular kind of subject. In other words, what was meant by design, which in German would be Gestaltung, as in Gestalt, was not only the design of objects, but also, and I would argue more crucially, it was the design of subjects. As Gropius put it in 1921, artistic work at the Bauhaus was merely the means through which one built oneself, in German, uns selbst aufbauen. Bau, in the school's name, signified more than architecture. Academies make a grave mistake by neglecting the formation of the human being, wrote Schlemmer that very same year. Bauhaus is building something very different from what was planned. It's building human beings, which meant that the two meanings of Gestaltung, the design of things and the design of the self, were already merging into one. Which inevitably brings me to the final technique that I want to discuss tonight, designing. Listen to this exercise that Kandinsky assigned in his theory of form course at the Bauhaus. Take a ground plane, 30 by 30 centimeters. You're allowed to use 9 colors, 3 primary, 3 secondary, 3 black, white, and gray. Create 18 small fields, 5 by 10 centimeters. Emphasize the center, balance above and below. If Kandinsky developed self-contained assignments such as this one to be followed step by step, Klee, who taught the same class, provided formulas, either geometric or arithmetic, for the same purpose. Both in his lecture notes and in the notes of his students, we find Klee was really fond of using matrices of numbers to transform grids by mirroring, turning, inverting, etc. This meant that formal variations were produced not arbitrarily, but according to a painstakingly worked out set of rules. Klee described this as exact research. Mathematics, he wrote in 1928, provide the rules to be followed or broken. It compelled the artist to be concerned with operations rather than with finished form. Inwardness mattered only if ordered rigorously through mathematical protocols. This was a peculiarly 19th century argument, not only because it evoked Helmholtz's suggestion that Kennen, or kinesthetic knowing, too might achieve scientific rigor, but also because the two stages of inwardness that Klee articulated, simple inwardness and inwardness guided by rules, corresponded to a basic distinction of 19th century psychology between haphazard self-observation and methodical introspection. Even the most adamant experimentalist of psychologists, Wilhelm Wundt, never tired of repeating that psychological research had to be as committed to introspection as to experimentation. But because experience, unlike other objects of scientific study, did not lend itself to being objectified, one could not simply turn one's gaze inward and examine one's feeling like one could observe an object outside of oneself. The difficult question then was this: how could the conspicuously biased practice of self-examination be turned into a rigorous method? The peculiar shape of the psychological experiment tackled the problem by devising protocols no less rigorous than Klee's matrices. Attaching themselves to mechanical contraptions, experimental psychologists measure the intensity and duration of elementary sensations produced on the bodies of their fellow experimenters as much as on their own. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that the modern designer was taught to perform a similar set of operations. As in the experimental psychology laboratory, the boundary between introspection and social performance was a blurry one at the Bauhaus. The process of examining one's inner experience methodically was usually realized in public. Just as school teachers, using stigmography in secondary school drawing classes, perform the formalist exercise in front of a classroom full of children, Bauhaus instructors combined lecturing with in-class demonstrations. One student recalled, for example, and I imagine she was referring to something like this, that Kandinsky brought a large number of differently colored rectangles, squares, discs, and triangles in various colors with him. He held these up in front of us in different combinations in order to test our powers of vision. The props used at the Bauhaus and those used in experimental psychology laboratories were nearly indistinguishable. Pairs of contrast studies on oversized pieces of cardboard, for example. These things are this big. After leaving the Bauhaus, Max Bill at Ulm would continue the practice of performing with props of experimental psychology in the design classroom. So would Albers at Black Mountain College and Yale. I think it's appropriate to put it in a loop. I can't open the water, never mind. So in the hopes of returning to the question of drawing circles that I started with, I want to ask again, what were the epistemological implications of such familiar modernist exercises? More specifically, what were the disciplinary implications of this commitment to kinesthetic knowing? If kinesthetic knowing had the potential to be the foundation of all human sciences, as some claimed in the late 19th century, where did adopting its techniques replace modern design education with respect to other disciplines. Before I attempt an answer, however, I should stress again, over against persistent assumptions about the radicalness of the Bauhaus, that this was ultimately a backward-looking model of education. Even when it adopted the techniques of this other way of knowing, the Bauhaus remained faithful to the 19th century conception of the whole man, at the heart of the 19th century ideal of Bildung. This was the subject type that Gropius summoned when he drew up the famous circular curricular diagram with Bau in its center. And this was done in 1922. Note that the preliminary course, this time called Vorlehre, is the outermost ring of the curriculum, and Bau, building, is in the center. It's the ultimate goal of the entire enterprise, despite the fact, mind you, that until 1927, the school actually did not have an architecture workshop. So it was all air in the middle. Or when Moholy-Nagy lamented the segmented man, who, he wrote, lived unnaturally, constantly fought with his own instincts, and was violated by external knowledge, which he called Wissen. In 1937, after he started teaching at Harvard, Gropius evoked the bull's eye diagram again, this time on the other side of the ocean. Preliminary artistic training was a new groundwork, he wrote this time, not for specialized art schools, but for schools on all levels of the educational system. The foundationalist epistemology of kinesthetic knowing, if offered at every level of the education system, would grow concentrically like the annular rings of a tree, he added, embracing the whole from the beginning and at the same time gradually deepening and extending it. In other words, even while adopting the epistemological project of kinesthetic knowing, the pedagogical techniques devised at the Bauhaus aspire to rehabilitate the withering ideal of Bildung, except with Kennen rather than Wissen. So this is a very 19th century enterprise. By the time that this curricular diagram was published, much had changed at the Bauhaus. Under intense pressure in an increasingly polarized political environment, the school had been forced to move from Weimar to Dessau, and soon afterwards, the school was incorporated into the German university system, which meant that Bauhaus masters were now Bauhaus professors. Gropius hired the architect Hannes Meyer in 1927 to inaugurate the much-delayed architectural workshop, the aspirational core of the bull's eye diagram. A year later, Gropius stepped down, leaving his position as director to Meyer, whose short-lived directorship reinforced what seemed like an irreversible sea change in the school's history. In the grid of the new curricular diagram, the preliminary course was still in place, but the curriculum was now structured so that instruction progressed toward increasing specialization. This was not simply a superficial change in the meaning of bauen. In Meyer's Bauhaus, architecture was no longer to be the elusive but optimistically transdisciplinary, and I'm saying transdisciplinary on purpose here, target of Bauhaus pedagogy. Nor did Bauen allude to the making of a whole man aligned with ideals of Bildung borrowed from the previous century. By the time Mies assumed directorship in Berlin, the preliminary course was no longer mandatory, and the precarious balance of disciplinary forces that had made the core of Gropius's 1922 diagram possible had become history. Such changes occurred against the background of a seismic shift in the disciplinary topography of German universities, a shift in the direction that neo-Kantians had predicted in the 1890s as the result of what they claimed was the inherent difference in method between the natural and the human sciences, by which in the German context means humanities and the social sciences. By the early 20th century, psychology was no longer given the privileged epistemological status that it had enjoyed previously as a Vorwissenschaft, a preliminary science. By all accounts, by the end of World War I, the ambitious project of establishing the human sciences and the foundation of kinesthetic knowing seemed to have fallen apart. Even Dilthey, that famous theorist of experience, identified a problem in the project of constructing an aesthetics from below. The experiential analysis of sensations, he wrote, was nothing but an experimental analysis of stimulus and sensation. How could anyone pretend that they could measure experience with anything resembling scientific rigor, or, for that matter, know the difference between unmediated sensation and mediated perception? Curiously, however, Gropius's bullseye curricular diagram that posited architecture as the ideal with which to educate the whole man was revived on the other side of the ocean, not by Gropius at Harvard, but rather by Moholy-Nagy, who was invited in 1937 by the chairman of the Container Corporation of America to establish a new Bauhaus in Chicago. The similarities between the two circular diagrams notwithstanding, the educational programs offered at the two schools were markedly different. Moholy-Nagy promised potential donors in America that the studios of the new Bauhaus would be laboratories for industry. In Chicago, the weaving workshop became the textile studio. Fashion, display, exhibition, decorating, and film publicity appeared as new categories. Still, Moholy-Nagy resurrected in Chicago what Gropius could not at Harvard, an obligatory four-course. This preliminary course, the prospectus of the school insisted, was meant to help shorten the road to self-experience, once again, a reference to Bildung, with the ultimate goal of achieving what Charles Morris, professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago and an important figure in the American Unity of Science movement, called intellectual integration. They also came up with visual communication, which still exists in some institutions, such as mine. In Germany, the preliminary course had been made possible by a discourse in which kinesthetic knowing was posited as the foundation of a constellation of human disciplines. In America, one might argue, the preliminary course became possible again at another moment of crossing disciplinary boundaries. That is, at that moment when the war boosted interdisciplines of cybernetics, computation, etc. were considered the new lingua franca of the sciences, but that's a different story. Despite these dramatic changes in the disciplinary landscape, kinesthetic knowing persisted, not as a foundationalist epistemological principle, but simply as habits. Students in Chicago, after all, spent their days doing more or less what the Bauhaus students in Weimar, Dessau, or Berlin had been doing, and what design students would continue to do for decades to come. They learned to assume an immediacy between form and affect, to draw in a gestural manner, and most importantly, they learned to design, which meant devising protocols to generate formal iterations, testing the effects of those forms on themselves, and finally making judgments, whether alone or in the company of others, as in a desk or a review, about the best one. In this sense, even while kinesthetic knowing may have lost its credibility as the foundation of an entire constellation of sciences, it survived in the silent, everyday practices of the design studio. Decades after psychophysics no longer enjoyed currency outside of the psychological laboratory, design students around the world would be trained through formal manipulation. Juxtaposing, rotating, reversing, superimposing, and transforming forms all day, they would be producing a peculiar form of knowledge unlike any other at the university. Thank you.